Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're developing a full stack web application using Python Django as our backend and React.js frontend. This is not the first video in this tutorial series. We've already set up our Python Django backend and our React.js frontend. We've enabled page navigation using React Router, and we've created a navigation menu with Material UI. And next to that, we've also started a basic CRUD example where we are able to create, read, update, and delete records. In this video, we're going to go one step further and we're going to focus on form validation. And with form validation, we will be able to restrict the input that users can put inside of our application. To implement form validation in our current project, we are going to be following 6 main steps. We're going to start by installing some packages, and after that we're going to import those packages into our create.js file, because that's where we are going to put some validation on our forms. Next, we're going to create some rules for validation, and we're going to pass those validation rules to our React hook form. We're also going to make a small change to our forms so they can display the error messages based on our validation rules. And as a last step, we're going to test to make sure that everything works the way we expect. And before we get started with this video, a small change that I've made to my backend. In the previous videos, you saw that when I edited or deleted a field, the changes were not immediately visible on my homepage. And the reason for that is that we were receiving an old version of the API request that we've made. And that is because that I constantly look back at our self.query set in our dev.list. And if you don't want that and you want things to be up to date, which I would recommend, then you need to change the query set in dev.list to project.objects.all. And with that small change made, let's continue and get started on the form validation. And if you've been following this tutorial series, you know that we've been using React hook form for making sure that our forms can be submitted to our backend. And if we go to the documentation, you can see that they already have some information on schema validation. You can see that they support schema-based form validation using yup, zot, superstruct, and joy. And then you can pass that validation schema into our use form instance and do some configurations. Now, in this instance, we are going to be using yup validation. And the reason for that is that I'm simply most familiar with this one. Looking at this documentation, there are 2 steps that we need to take in order to use these things. The first step is making sure that we do all of the installs. And the installs are going to be hook form / resolvers and also yup. And the hook form / resolver is going to enable us to put the validation rules on our use form. And yup is going to be the package that we can use to actually configure our validation. So I'm going to copy over this command, go back to my code and cd into my front end. And in there, I'm going to paste the command that is going to install the hook form resolvers and yup. And we'll give it some time, and that is our first step completed. The next step that we need to take is we need to make sure that we have the right imports into the page where our forms are. And you can see right here that we need to import yup resolver from hook form / resolvers / yup. And we also need to import everything from yup as yup. So I'm going to copy over this statement, go to my code, and paste that inside of our create.js file, because this is where we are going to create the validation for our forms. Now, as you can see on the bottom here, they use a constant called schema to define the validation rules of the different form fields. So you can see here that they can do it based on the object, where for each of the form fields they are going to define the rules. But you can also just put in generic comments, such as making all of them required. For now, I'm just going to copy over everything on the top here for the constant schema and change it a little bit so we can create our own validation rules for our forms. So back in our code and underneath the default values, I'm going to paste in the constant schema. And in here, we can define the validation rules for all of our different forms. And if you recall from our previous videos, we've got forms for the name, the status, comments, the start date, and the end date. So those are also the ones that we're going to define as validation rules. The first thing we will define is the name. And in here we can firstly highlight what kind of data types we're expecting in this form field. And in this case that is a string. And we can also put in whether it is a required form or whether it's not a required form. In this case I'm going to make name required. And the same thing is going to go for the status field. For the status field, I also want it to be a string, and I also want this field to be required. The next field that we also have is comments, and in there I'm just going to specify that it is a string, but this field is not necessarily required, so it's going to be fine like this. And we also have a start date and an end date that we need to populate. Now these are obviously not string fields, but they are date fields. So in here I'm going to put yup.date because we're going to be expecting a date value for this one, and the same for the end date, like so. And also for the dates, I want them to be required. So I'm going to put in dot required similarly to the other fields, and I can just copy this over for end date. Now there are quite some things that you can configure right here. You can basically do whatever kind of rule you want, you can implement here. And one of the things, for example, that I always want to do is in all of these required brackets, I want to write my own error text for when something goes wrong. Because, for example, here for start date, it is just going to refer to the technical name as needing to be required, but I want to have a little bit more of a friendly name for the user. So inside of these brackets, I can put the error message that we actually want to see on the screen. So in this case, it's going to be name is a required field, and we can do the same thing for all of these other ones. So status is a required field, needs to pop up when it did not provide a status, and we can also do the same thing for the start date and end date. So start date is a required field, and same thing here for end date is a required field. And let's just put an A here as well, like so. So you can in here put the error text that you would like to see on the screen. And of course, there are many other things possible. You can indicate that some fields can only be positive numbers or negative numbers, or that it cannot exceed a certain value. And I will give you one example with our end date. Because since we are working with a project and we have a start date and an end date, I don't want the end date to be before the start date, because that makes no sense for our use case. So to realize this, I can add a rule here that says dot min, and in here we can define the minimum value that should be there. And if I do yup.ref, I can specify that I want to take a look at the start date field, and after this condition I can define my message, and that message is going to be end date cannot be before the start date, and let's close it off like so. So by adding a minimum requirement, it's going to look by using yup.ref to our start date, and if our start date is preceding the end date, it is going to throw this error message that we have defined right here. So we have now defined our validation rules, and the next thing that we can do is pass these rules into our form. Because right now we have a constant handle submit and also control, and we have use form where we pass in the default values, but we need to extend this with our schema so that our forms know which kind of validation rules are going to be checked. And to do that, we are going to add a comma after our default values, and I'm going to state resolver is equal to yup resolver, and then we're going to open up some brackets and we're going to define schema as the schema that it needs to validate. And now our forms on the bottom here know that before the submission it needs to evaluate the rules that are specified in our schema. So let's save that and go to our front end to take an initial look. So I've now started my front end and my backend server, and let's take a look if our validation schema is actually being enforced when we want to submit a record. So I'm going to go to our create page right here, and I'm going to submit a record with a project name, a comment, and a status, but not with a start date and an end date. And let's see what happens. And usually when we do something like this, it should just submit and go to our homepage. So let's see what it does right now. And as you can see, I can click the submit button as many times as I want, but currently it is not submitting. So it seems like our rules for validation are working. The only downside right now is that the user does not see why this form does not submit, because it doesn't show any type of messaging. And that is what we're going to be changing right now. So we are back in our code and we need to make some changes to our form fields to enable the error messages in our forms. So we're going to start with our text field. And inside of our text field, we need to add two new parameters or configuration options to make sure that our errors show up correctly. The first thing that we need to add is something called error. And error is going to be equal to, open these square brackets, and then exclamation point, error. And what this does, it's going to look at the field state and specifically taking a look at the error. And if an error is there, it's going to throw an error in the form as well. So it's this control component is looking at our form. Our form is then picking up whether there's an error in there based on the validation rules or not. And if that error is there, our form text field from material UI is going to throw this error. And the reason we're specifying two exclamation points is because we want this to be a Boolean value. So it's either is an error or it is not an error. And what this particular statement does, it's going to make sure that the outline of our form is going to be red. But we also want to have the text from our error specified underneath our form. And to realize that, we're going to add another parameter in here called helper text. And that helper text is going to tell the user what is actually wrong. And in there, we can specify error question mark dot message. And what this does, it's going to check whether there's an error or not. And if there's an error, it's going to show the message to the user. So let's save this and let's see what it looks like in our front end right now. So we are back in our front end, and now that we have changed the text field, our name form should provide an error message if we do something wrong. And when I click on submit, you can indeed see that the outside of name is going to be all red, and it also specifies our helper text right here. And it states that name is a required field. So this is behaving the way we expect. And you can also see that back in the React text field component documentation, where you can also see that, you use the error parameter to make sure that it's red, and you use the helper text to actually get the message in there. So now we need to do the same thing for the other forms. Now the multi-line field is going to be very easy. You can just copy over the parameters right here, because the multi-line field actually also uses a text field. So that's going to be exactly the same. So we can copy and paste the same as before and save it like so. The select field is going to be a little bit different. And if we go to the documentation and we switch over to select, we can see how Material UI typically handles this. So we're going to scroll down a little bit until we are going to find validation somewhere. And you can see here that this form has all red around it and the arrow displayed. So let's take a look in the code on what they're exactly. And if we scroll down right here, you can see that the error text is displayed in a block called form helper text. So it is not a different setting that we can put in our select form, but it's something that we need to put in there separately. So I'm going to go to the top and I'm going to copy over the import of the form helper text from material UI, material form helper text, and I'm going to put that in my code as well. So back in my select fields.js, and you can see on the top that I have imported the form helper text from @material UI /material/form helper text. And underneath our select statement, I need to present this form helper text. And let's actually take the right one because this is correct. Like so. Alright. And what you will see now is that we get an error because everything inside of our controller component needs to be one block. Now we can change this very quickly by just copying over the form control and the input label part and pasting that inside of our controller part, and then also take the form control and tag and put it after our form helper text, like so. And the reason that this is going to work is that the entire form or the entire output that you want to see is now wrapped in the form control block, so it's all in one block, like so. Okay, so we now have our select form right here. We have the box underneath the select part that is going to display the message, but we now need to add the same parameters as for the text field. So I'm just going to copy over the error and the helper text, and I'm going to paste that inside of our select. And the error thing, that is correct, it can stay there, but the helper text, we actually need to copy over the end result and put that between the form helper text like this. And then we can delete the helper text parameter that is specified here. So for the select form, we can just put the error inside of the select field, but the error message needs to be provided separately. And let's save that and see what it looks like when we want to submit our status form. So we are back inside of our code, and you can now see that we do get the red line underneath, and when we submit it, it also provides status as a required field, but our status message actually shows up in gray instead of red. And to change that, we're going to simply format the way that this error message is going to look, so it is the same color as in name. This is a little bit of a workaround to make it look the same as as the name field right here. So to make the error message look a little bit more like the other field, we're going to add styling by saying sx is equal to double open brackets. And in there, we're going to specify that the text color should be equal to hashtag D32F2F, because this is the same color as the error message is for the other field. And if we now go back to our front end and we submit the form again, you can see that our status text is going to be red. And for me, for now, that is good enough. Now, the last field that we also need to change is the date picker fields. Now, the way that it works for date picker field is a little bit different again than what we've seen before. So on the date picker itself, we can add an additional parameter that is called slot props. And we can open that up with double squarely brackets, and in there we can define a parameter or a setting called text field, and we can open that one up again with squarely brackets, and in here we can define error as double exclamation point error, just like before, and we can define helper text as error question mark dot message. And the thing here, which is a little bit different than what we've seen before, is that we don't need to put them between squarely brackets. Also, we use this colon instead of an is sign, but this is the way that you can get it to work for a date picker field. So let's take a look at what it looks like in our front end. So we are back in our front end, and I've just submitted the form, and you can see that the start date and the end date now also turns red, and it states that start date is a required field and that end date is a required field. And you can also see if I fill in all of the correct fields here, such as the project, the status, and the start date, and I'm going to put the end date before the start date, so on the 11th, and it immediately says that the end date cannot be before the start date, so it will not submit. And if I put it after the end date with our correct data right here, we can submit it even without comments, because comments is not a required field. So if we now click submit, it should work the way that we expect, and you can see that our new project has been made here. So we have now successfully enabled form validation in our project using Yup form validation with React Hook Forms. You of course can also make this as crazy as you would like, and I would invite you to take a look at the Yup documentation if you want to do even more with the form validation rules. And you can of course also apply the same rules on your edit page, but I'm not going to do that for now. This is all for the video of today. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you do, please leave a like and subscribe. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how you can add a model choice field in your backend, in your frontend, and submit that successfully to our database. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.